how this works there. Okay, so today we'll start off talking about the problem, and so some of these earlier items I'll just race through pretty quickly since we've already been through them in my proposal meeting. Research questions and sub-questions, literature review, theoretical tools, methodology, how I actually carried out the study, results and discussion, and Q&A. And the problem, just a recap, many academic psychologists assert that popular psychology books may make false or exaggerated claims. They marginalize, stereotype, ban, and other pop psychology materials and those who write them. And oftentimes they seem to not be very familiar with the books that they are disqualifying. So this is not talking about people who read a book and have a proper review of it, but sometimes they're just disqualifying a whole body of books. And then on the other side is that there are, and you know what, I'm sorry, my PowerPoint screen is being blocked by our images. Oh, here we go. Let me just make a slight adjustment here. Okay, so the general public spends billions of dollars each year on popular psychology materials. Many people find these books to be helpful, inspiring, and even life-saving. And there's a growing body of evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of popular books for bibliotherapy. And we'll be talking about that later on. And meanwhile, many academic books are seen as too expensive and not as accessible. So our research questions: how should popular psychology be understood? How is popular psychology characterized by academic psychological science? And to what extent do these characterizations accurately and appropriately represent popular materials? And how might a more fair and fruitful relationship between academic and popular psychology be conceived? So for my literature review, we've already covered this in my proposal meeting and in the document, but just a couple important things about this. First, the literature review forms the basis for my own hypothesis and rival hypotheses. And this is required for my formal case study method. And I'll be talking in depth about that method in a little bit, but as I'm going through a very brief summary of the literature, I will point out where the literature that comprises my own and then the literature that comprises the rival. And then I also want to say that I really found for the first time ever in doing a literature review that this really felt to me like I was doing an investigation as part of the literature review. I wasn't just doing it because it was obligatory or just to see what else had been written, but I was really trying to understand my questions as I went through the literature. And so I felt like I almost kind of did two investigations here, the literature, but then I went with my actual method. I tested some of the theories in the literature, and maybe this is how it's supposed to work. And maybe I felt like this was the first time I've ever really been able so much to tie the two together, but I really appreciated that relationship there. And so there were two bodies of research. I was having trouble really finding a whole lot initially in the psychological literature, so I went to the sociological, and this was where I found a long history of study of the popularization of science. And in the sociological literature, there were a few themes that stood out. And I would say the most important concept was that of the dominant old traditional viewpoint of popularization and then the new viewpoint. And I'm just gonna jump right to here because really this does form the core of my rival hypothesis. And so the dominant old paradigm states that scientists acquire pure knowledge and then popularizers disseminate simplified accounts to the public. Any popularized knowledge must include a degradation, distorted view of the original knowledge, and it presupposes that genuine knowledge is easily distinguishable from popularized knowledge. And this is often accomplished by boundary work. And I understand that the word boundary work has many different meanings, perhaps similar, but within different contexts, it means different things. But here it is really speaking about, at least as far as Guerin, who would go on to be cited and quoted by so many other researchers, he felt that it had to do with the acquisition of intellectual authority and career opportunities. He felt that it was the ideological demarcation by scientists to separate out their work and its products from others. And this also had to do with resources, gaining resources for one side and denial of resources or opportunities for the other side. And so Dr. Felicity Meller also wrote an article where she was showing that there's two ways that boundary work happens here. One is to amp yourself up, elevate yourself over the other side. And the other way is to take I guess you could say it's appropriation of the other side's positive characteristics for oneself. And in my project, moving forward, one of the things that I found, I'll give you just a little bit of a glimpse of my results, was that popular books did sometimes take they emphasized or wrote about neuroscience when it really wasn't necessary, but I felt like this was an example of taking something from the other side that is popular or seen as valid and then trying to incorporate it into their own work. And in parapsychology, we see this where people will try to write about physics because physics is seen as more valid. And so this is also an important part of boundary work. And then, so there is also now the new viewpoint of popularization, and this is what forms my own position. And this is really the opposite. It's rejecting the top-down approach, rejecting the downstream approach. And it says that the downstream approach of knowledge is not correct. It's not linear. It's what you could say it's unidirectional, bidirectional. It doesn't just come from scientists to the public, but the public are scientists and they pass knowledge to the scientific community. And oftentimes they're one and the same. And also, all statements are passed on or transformed in some way. So the idea that there is just a single point of knowledge that you can identify and then say everything else is just insufficient popularization is just really not the case. And if you look at the literature in the last decade or so, researchers are saying that the new viewpoint, at least the sociological literature is saying that the new viewpoint has really taken hold. And some of this is because of the internet and because education is so, and resources and communication is so accessible to everyone these days. And then there's just the feminist perspective. Well, not just, but the final thing I'd like to point out about the sociological literature. And this was basically the idea that I kind of took the logic out of this one article, which was really interesting. It was talking about women who were present at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1831 to 1900. There were always women there, but their role was very different than the men. They were there to entertain the men or feed the men, but not to be part of the men. And so the basic logic that came from this is that at that time, scientists were men, women were not men, or they were not scientists. All women make up the populace. Therefore, the general population is incapable of critical or sensible thinking, because everyone knew that women were incapable of that. So that meant really the whole population was equated with the characteristics of the women. And as time went on, that would be included with the immigrants coming into the country as well. So this is something that was also echoed as I moved into the psychological literature, and included in here was some work by Susan Schmidt, who studied, she did a case study of Gail Shee's passages, and she found that journalists not only popularized and disseminated scientific research, but they also drew on it to advance their own arguments and frequently challenge academic findings and expertise. And social scientists responded to magazine articles and used or refuted ideas propagated in best-selling books, often weaponizing the notion of popularization to delegitimize, critique, and assert scientific authority and originality. So I'm just going to move forward a little more quickly here. The psychological literature, we also find one of the biggest influences was the what I'd call the skeptical agenda, which at first I did not realize this. So I came across these books, and the books that you see here are the main books that talk about popular psychology books. And in reading them, I continued to be amazed, because these books did not seem like scholarly works. They seemed to be doing everything that they were accusing popular books of doing. And so they were split between writers that seem very hostile, not neutral in any way, but seem to have a agenda to to marginalize humanistic, positive psychology. Both of those movements, they were pure materialists and behavioralists. And then there was also the religious books, the religious-oriented books that were really not even just against popular psychology, but in some cases all of psychology. And then with the skeptics, I started to see names pop up that I was familiar with, which and the more I did this, the more I found these names. I researched them, and some of these names are the leading skeptics known to parapsychologists to try to destroy that field. So I thought, well, this is an interesting connection. Why are these people in this area? And then they're also in the same area of speaking out against popular psychology books. And so then the other thing I found was that these same people are very influential in the whole field of psychology, such as Lilienfeld, who writes 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology. And that book is all over the internet. And if you just Google popular psychology, you will see books talking about, or articles talking about his book. And his co-author has been the head of skeptical organizations. So what I found was that really it is a theoretical framework of skepticism, which they don't identify as a framework. They just say we're the ones that are right. But these people really have not just been doing what you'd call science, but I'd say more so advocacy, and they've been successfully doing it. So this, and they write introduction to psychology books. They are prominent within the APA, some of them. So this was giving me a clue that there's something here, again, that's possibly more about frameworks and less about the materials themselves. But I wanted to really find that out. And then I'm just going to mention this really briefly. One of the few sources in all of the psychological literature was from Adams, and he identified 3 types of psychology topics, or 3 types of themes within the popular literature: naive homespun, therapeutic pop psychology, and popularization of scientific psychology. And I'm mentioning this because this is also part of one of my hypotheses, that I would find this in the books that I was using as part of my case study. And then I would say the biggest body of literature in the psychological realm had to do with bibliotherapy. And basically this is therapists that would use written materials to help their clients in some way. And this runs the range from therapists who say to a client, go read this book and come back and talk about it, or programs that are structured that include reading of materials and people to engage with them in some formal way. And suffice it just to say that the body of evidence, this is really where you get into actual experimental, well, actual surveys or studies that have, I would say a lot of them are survey based, and a lot of them have targeted psychologists and therapists and nurses and helping professionals. Across the board, they found that these materials were helpful, and they were at least, some felt they weren't as helpful as direct therapy, some thought they were more, and some thought at least they were better than nothing. Now, there has not been very much asking the public themselves what they thought of these materials. It's mostly been asking the professionals. And this term, bibliotherapy, is a term I had never heard of until I started to research this. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It's not a term you would hear in the general public. And who writes popular psychology materials? In my exploration of the literature, researchers with PhDs, psychotherapists, medical professionals, professors, professional writers, business professionals, people who developed a practice or skill, those who had an extraordinary life experience or struggles, and many writers would fall into more than one of these categories. And then a lot of people like to cite George Miller's 1969 presidential address to the APA, where he said, we need to give psychology away. So he was really talking about putting the power within the public, and there's not enough psychologists to go around to help all the people directly. And so the way to help them could be through these materials. And so now I would like to just move on to what my overarching framework is. I would say it's a constructionist framework. Kurt Danziger in particular, he is a prominent historian of psychology, and he has written the constructing the subject, naming the mind. The socially constructed nature of psychological knowledge is what he writes about. And he says all psychological categories are socially constructed. They're not stable things to be discovered. So he's rejecting a natural scientist's approach that these categories and everything in them are just there and we just go out and find them, but they're very much socially constructed. And so we felt that this would be a good approach to follow, because we're really talking about comparing two categories here, and those categories are popular and scholarly. And then we're also looking at the psychological construct of attention, which is, Danziger focused on other constructs such as memory and intelligence and wrote entire books about these, but he didn't cover attention. So that's one of several reasons why I'll be focusing on that construct as part of my case study. First, let me just take a little water break here. Why case study? Well, I've already at least shown you some examples of other people's case studies. So there is a lineage of people doing sociological studies with popularization, and they have pretty much all done case studies. method. So I knew I wanted to do a case study. And so I found Robert Yin's book, Case Study Research, Design, and Methods. And basically, I read the whole book, and then I outlined it, and then put it together into a consolidated method. I mean, he already had the method, but it was in a whole book. So then I extracted the main tenets of that. And he writes a lot, but basically you can water it down to there's structure and planning, and this is what makes it formal. He writes that there's so many people doing case studies, but they may very well have structure and planning, but a lot of times when they write up their study, you really don't see how they pre-planned for it. And so with his method, the structure and planning is everything. Bounding the study just means what are your sources, how many, why are you using them, the parameters of it. And then again, forming your hypothesis and rival hypothesis. And organized note-taking, having a plan for how you're going to do your notes, doing them in a structured way, and then comparing your findings to both hypotheses. And with the organized note-taking, he says this is what leads to greater levels of reliability. If you take your notes and you document everything, then you should be able to hand what you did to another researcher, and they should be able to replicate that. So unlike other people who do qualitative research and believe you really can't establish validity or reliability like you can in experimental materialistic realms, he feels that you can establish reliability in this way, and that you can also establish validity by closely tying your literature to your hypothesis and ongoing plans. And then attention, it's a historically enduring category. It's a category that's changed over the years, impacted by economic, technological, and social conditions. It's less controversial. It's less controversial than, I wanted to stay away from the topic of positive psychology or humanistics, since these other writers have so much gone against them. I wanted to take a fresh category that I could look at and just where there really doesn't tend to be debates within the field of attention. And I'm saying that probably someone who researches attention and different aspects of it might say something different, but it seems less controversial at the moment. But it is a subject of a growing number of books enjoying increasing sales. And I was very curious as to what a popular book on attention is all about. And I also wanted to learn about it for my other research interests. So I figured, well, if I have to read numerous books, it might as well be on a subject that's going to teach me something I want to learn about. So my main assessment, while several characteristics of their books and authors were compared, 4 foci were central to this examination. So these included how easy is it to categorize popular and scholarly based on current university library guidelines, and then handling of factual statements in relation to references, bibliotherapeutic value, and then somewhat along those same lines, but how much potential the book had for helping its readers in the aspects for which it was intended to do so. And I emphasize intended because sometimes it seems as if in reading criticisms about popular books, those who are doing the criticizing suggest the book isn't achieving something, and it seems like sometimes it's not trying to achieve what they're being judged against. So I felt that was important. So my general summary of procedures: collect all titles on attention, or as many as I could find, get data on these and put them into a database, which basically my database was an Excel sheet. Separate out the books that are academic versus scholarly based on library guides. Choose 6 scholarly books and 6 popular books. Now, initially I had less books I was going to do, but I just in the end, I didn't feel that less would really do the topic justice. So that turned out to be a good number, I thought. Perform a thematic analysis of the books. Collect reviews from Google Scholar and Amazon on collected books. Analyze at least 5 statements and their references for accuracy compared to original source, compared to primary and rival hypotheses, and report findings. So I just took a screenshot of my entire spreadsheet. So I had 145 entries going back to 1880. And again, the books had to have attention in their title to really be about attention. There were sometimes books that had attention in the title, but it really wasn't about that. And then I did exclude, I included some books on meditation, and as you'll see, I did include several books on attention deficit disorder, but there were still books on meditation that I excluded, and some on ADD as well, because there were so many. But I feel like this list is really comprehensive in terms of books on attention overall. And online, there were like some small lists from a couple different sites of attention books, but maybe like those lists would be 15, 20 items long. So I really feel happy that I've compiled this, and maybe this will be useful to someone in the future. So I used library guides. I collected different guides together, and this one I found most interesting because it did have a flow chart. I won't read the whole chart here, but just source, did you find this article in a library database? It's asking if it was in a peer-reviewed journal. Now this is talking more about articles, because I didn't find things that spoke only to books, so I had to compile these guidelines that address, they seem to be a little heavier duty on articles, but overall, so there's the source, then authors. They're asking, are authors affiliated with a university? What are their credentials? If they don't have credentials, it's probably not scholarly. And then content, does the article attempt to persuade or bias the reader? Does the article have a works cited or bibliography? Is it longer than, well, in this case, it's asking about length. But so this helped to form my definition of what's scholarly and what is popular. And so I just wanted to, even though I'm going to still outline my methods, I'm going to just say what I found was easier and what was harder. So psychological science, behavioral psychology, or cognitive psychology titles were easy. Usually, these included words pertaining to different kinds of attention, joint attention, human performance, human behavior, words like condition, visual attention, selective attention and vision, cross-modal attention, cognition, neuroscience. So these were executive function, self-regulation. So if these words were in the title, usually, I would say all the time, they also had a publisher that was an academic publisher. You knew it was because it said like university press. And so these were easy to distinguish as scholarly. And some of the words had words like more scientific words like theory, conceptual, measurement, clinical, principles. These are all the words in the titles. These were clues, and I found I had an easy time just saying, okay, these are going to be scholarly. Now, I don't know if I could express this, but this was a challenge. On the one hand, I'm trying to identify, are they scholarly or are they popular? On the other hand, it's almost, some of these decisions are arbitrary. So I'll talk more about that later. The hardest, there were about 25 of 145 that were quite challenging. And then in the end, I had an even harder time with just 10. And then even after selecting the final 12, at the start, I didn't get too far, but just when I started to read through the books, I decided to switch to swap them out to either category. And the bottom line here is that I feel like if this was such a hard task for myself, we can translate this to, let's say, undergraduate students or any students that are given an assignment by their teacher and told, you know, you need to have scholarly materials. If I had already put so much thought into this, and if I had such a hard time, we really have to ask, is it even fair to ask students, unless it's an exercise, you know, an exercise in doing something similar, but we can't expect that students are going to have an easy time doing this as well. And in a few minutes, or at the end of this presentation, I'll make some suggestions for how we might get rid of this two-party designation and come up with a different way of looking at this. So 12 books, my 12 book criteria, they needed to be recent. They needed to all have attention in the title. They needed to be representative of their type of book. And I wanted the books balanced between the two categories as much as possible. And then overall aim to have 12 books represent what is out there in the field of attention. Now, I say balance between the two categories. I would say in the end, this wasn't necessarily that possible, but for example, I was hoping to have attention deficit disorder books in both the popular and the scholarly categories. But as I read every book I read through, I ended up feeling like they felt they should fall into the popular categories. So in that respect, you know, it would have been nice to have ADD in popular, ADD in scholarly, attention, media attention books in both, but it didn't work out that way. It really turned out that the scholarly books were more either about philosophy of attention or neuroscience, cognitive science. So these are the books in the popular category I ultimately decided on. And, oops, okay, these are the books in the scholarly. And it's kind of interesting. What do you notice here? This seems just brighter, brighter colors, prettier colors. So, so this was, as you're going to see here, I broke down so many characteristics of the books, including even did an assessment on the book covers. Okay, so were biases involved in original designations and leading me to switch categories? So this is really significant, and I'll be focusing on especially on Driven to Distraction by Hollowell and Rady, I think is how you pronounce their names. And you can see they're both MDs. And initially I thought that that book should be a scholarly book because they were both doctors. They're talking about a psychological disorder. And so I stuck them in that category. And then once I got into the book, I found some surprising things. For example, there was no bibliography. There were no references given at all for this book. And so that right off was a big red flag. And then in just reading it and seeing that they did sometimes refer to other people's research, but the way it was done was so haphazardly. And as I write in my paper, they did have one chapter on neuroscience, and they would just cite somebody that they had talked to, like somebody, you didn't know who it was it a friend? Sometimes they said it was a leading researcher in the field, and they would cite what the researcher did by saying their name in one paragraph, and then in another paragraph, they would say this person spoke at this conference, or this person did write this article, but they wouldn't say the name of the article until a few more paragraphs later, and it would just be a partial name and you wouldn't know where to find it. So it was this I eventually realized was what was maybe a symptom, because both these guys say that they have ADD. So maybe that was the explanation. If someone with an extreme case of ADD was going to write a book, maybe this was how they were going to write it. But in the end, I felt like this really needed to go into the popular category. The other thing was that it had hundreds of Amazon reviews. And we'll get to that later to see how so many of the popular books did have so many Amazon reviews. However, the other thing I'll just bring up here is that Driven to Distraction had over 900 Google Scholar citations. So that means that 900 sources have cited them. And many of these sources are journal articles. So you have journal articles citing a book that has 0 references in it. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And you really find that with the popular books as well. And this is going to be speaking soon to my hypothesis that information is in fact, what I've found is unidirectional, or multi-directional. Because these as it turns out, these guys were really more so building on their expertise as they were longtime psychiatrists, and they had specialized in this field, and they did have much knowledge, and the book was extremely informative, but it just didn't go along with your expectations of scholarly. And this is considered one of the first books on the subject of ADD. And then you also have Attention Beyond Mindfulness by Gay Watson. And I initially put her book into the popular category. It seemed like just the word mindfulness, it is a word used at least in our department. But still, it seemed like she was talking more about meditation, and this is where I saw I had some assumptions that a topic such as this, and especially because I wasn't that familiar with the publisher. You couldn't tell from when I looked up the publisher, it seemed like they had a vast array of books, and they did publish many popular books, but the books were educational, but it didn't seem like an academic publisher. And so I realized once I got into her book that she did outline a framework. She did have a structure it seemed like she had done interviews with people on attention to learn what attention meant to them. And so it was structured, it was fairly well referenced. And so I felt like it should go into the scholarly category, so I swapped those out. Now, I just want to say too that I did do some tests to see if I hadn't swapped them out, if my overall results would have been different. And it didn't seem like it would have made that much of a difference overall, as you'll see when I try to put everything together. Okay, so I did I'm just going to run through this really quickly. I did a thematic, I did several analyses. So I looked at attributes. Let me see here. Okay, actually, this is just the steps I took. So the actual procedures, I made notes in the ebooks themselves. So I used ebooks, and because I felt like those would be most accessible and easiest to work with to write my final paper. I made notes in the ebooks. I put them all into a Word document, and this Word document became it's probably close to 250 pages. And then I realized I needed to really get a handle on my organization from that. So I created spreadsheets with theme headings. And then I came up with rating using a descriptive rating scale of 1 to 3. Now, this isn't something that Yin had suggested, but I felt like this would help me to keep track of my assessments, because there were so many different characteristics of every book that I was assessing. And I felt that worked really well. So this was Not a formal scale in any means. It was really just for descriptive. It was a descriptive tool that I found to be very useful. And then I analyzed at least five statements, sometimes several more within text citations and references. And I used the same scale for everything. And then I put final ratings into spreadsheets. And so with my scale, 0 was there's no information to assess or does not apply. 1 would be lowest, marginal, small amount, least amount of credit should be given. Medium amount was for number 2, it deserves an intermediate amount of credit. And 3, it deserves the highest credit or reflects the highest amount. So everything could be reduced to one of these. Felt this would be helpful. I felt this would be helpful since I'd be comparing two categories of books. So in the end, I would have some numbers to compare. And then also to ensure inter-rater reliability, this was very subjective, but I still revisited my choices often until they were mostly consistent. So comparison of factual statements with original published experimental or study data. So this was very important, especially since there has been a doubt about whether books are appropriately representing original research. So what I looked at here was how many references, how well referenced, did the reference accurately depict the original source? What was the original source? Was the original source the best choice? Did the statement reflect other popularizations rather than original source, or was it a combination? And how well do the facts from studies lead then to either findings, arguments, and integrating the materials with the discussion that the author is giving? Like giving different perspectives. So I tried to look at not even just the statement itself, but the surrounding statements or what the statement was being used, and did their use of the source help with that, or how well did they present arguments? Now I'm just running through a few more steps and then I'll get to my results. So I assessed book type and quality of information, purpose of book, and was this achieved? Methodological approach, was this defined and presented? Tone, voice, structure, language, intended audience. I also did a book an external assessment. So this was book reviews and Google Scholar citations. And I looked at Amazon reviews, how many stars, what was said, how reliable might these be, and who were the reviewers. And I started to notice that there were, especially for certain books, such as Women with ADD, the Holloway and Rady ADD book, these books had high emotionality in the reviews about these books. Were very, like a lot of excitement, extreme emotions being expressed. And I thought that that was probably a better measure than if reviewers just kind of restated what the authors themselves had restated, just because, you know, someone had asked them to do a review. But I really looked at the emotionality of the reviews to base some assessments on, and then the number of reviews, and then number of Google citations, Google Scholar citations. How many were there for the books? What types of sources went on to cite these books? And who was the publisher of those citations? And again, this speaks to what's happening with these books, who ultimately is using them. And like I said with the example before, with the 900 citations, these books are getting cited within formal journal articles. So the information from these books are moving into the scientific and academic arenas. Book structure assessment, I assessed the number of pages of the books, the chapter structures, the chapter headings, Table of contents, how well done. Some table of contents were very easy to understand what the book was going to be about, others not so much. Book covers, ease of Kindle version navigation. Was there forward? By whom? Was there an index? What extras were included? This was important for some books. Were there pages or location numbers? Book author assessment, who's the author? What are their academic credentials? What are their professional credentials? Are they the best person to write the book? Self-promotion tactics. And then I also looked at the impact of the books on myself. How did it impact me as an overall reader? What did I learn from the book as far as the subject matter? What did each book teach me about writing and research? And I have to say quite a bit, and I'm very grateful for that. What did each book teach me? Well, did I like the book? What were my own biases that became apparent as I went along? And what did this book teach me about the topic of attention? Did it expand my understanding of what attention is about and how it can be understood or approached? And then at the end, I took all that and I did what Yin calls pattern matching logic. I compared my findings to the hypothesis, rival hypothesis, and I recorded my key takeaway findings in the discussion section. And we are already, I know I'm going over my time here, I just noticed. Now I have my results, but I see I'm past time. Can Dr. Osgood?
An extra 5 minutes, Deborah?
Okay. All right, I'll just show you very briefly my final results. So I put this together in this chart. And I'm just going to try to move over. Again, I'm having my screen issues here. Okay, so you can see my totals. And here I have all the different categories: rating scale for how accurately portrayed original research, number of references, formality of language. I put everything here. And if you just look at the totals, you will see that there were higher totals for the scholarly category is in the lower bottom of the screen. And you'll see that those totals are higher overall until you get to, is the author an expert in the topic, ease with working with the references, number of Amazon reviews, and rating scale for level of social impact and helpful resources. And then I broke down that larger chart into smaller charts. And I'll just to summarize, let's see, a rating chart for factual statements. The bottom line here was really that I did find that even though the popular books, still, many of them did have bibliographies. They did have a lot of references. They were not as well. Referenced to the original sources as the scholarly books, and especially the neuroscience. So the ones that had to do with neuropsychology of attention, orientating of attention, the psychology of attention, those books had a lot more references in them. They seemed to cite original sources better. They spoke in a more neutral language, meaning that they weren't, I guess you could say that there was some exaggerating. I didn't find any outrightly incorrect statements in the popular books. I didn't find any gross misrepresentations. And now that could be a little bit subjective of how you're defining that. Sometimes, especially I would say Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention, that was written by a man named Nir, N-I-R is his last name. And he really sometimes took what he found in a popularized version. He didn't seem to go to the original source at times when there was an original source, like a journal article. And at times he did over exaggerate, like the original researcher would say, well, this research is promising or suggestive of a finding, but we need to look into this more. And then the popular author, Nur, he would oftentimes say that it was definitive, like this, there's no doubt at all, and he would use very strong language about this has been proven. So there was a difference between, but I found that mostly just with his books, not so much with the other popular books. And still, he did still have several references. He had 250 references in his book. So that wasn't always the case, but with the 5 that I looked at very closely, it seemed to be. I'm just going to skip here. Helpfulness in bibliography assessment, Amazon reviews and Google Scholar citations. I looked at those, and again, it was really remarkable how many more reviews the popular books had. If you could see the total here, 1722. So when I added them up, the popular books had 1,722 Amazon reviews. Altogether, the scholarly books had only 14 Amazon reviews. And I did a check because I thought, well, maybe this is because these books are being published and sold elsewhere, not just on Amazon. But then I did a check, like for introductory psychology textbooks, they had hundreds of reviews. So there was something about these books that either aren't being reviewed or aren't being read in the scholarly category. And then Google citations, you didn't have, Google Scholar citations, you didn't have as many, but you did have, actually, I think I gave you the number. I think I'm missing a number here. If I just do a quick adding up here, you can see actually that's over close to 4,000 Amazon reviews for the popular, but 14 for the scholar. And that's not a mistake. I checked that dozens of times going through those. So then here, the Google Scholar citations are 1722 and 1522. So you can see they're not that different. You would expect to have a whole lot more citations for those. And then I'm just going to skip over here. My hypotheses were mostly confirmed, except that I did find that scholarly books did do a better job of referencing and discussing original research. I did not find any sign that there were like homespun or folk psychology within the popular books. I felt that the popular books were very much written from professionals who had a very high level of experience, number of experiences, years of experience, I should say. And so I felt like much of what was in the popular books was coming from people's direct professional experience. And just to take 2 more minutes for my key findings, I found that really, rather than saying books are scholarly or books are popular, there could be a third category that would say they can fall into both categories, because I really felt that a couple of the books could have fallen into both categories. They just, not all books can be distinguishable. And then I found that more useful would be let the primary original source designation be the guide, because there's so many reasons to cite works. And I already knew this, but I found this out more from my study, different reasons for citing books other than that it was from an experiment or something formal in a journal. If you want to talk about the history, if you want to talk about the origin of something, if you want to talk about just someone has a particular experience, so much of this is not going to be in a formal journal. And if everything is excluded, which, as I'm sure you all know from your vast experience, there are many peer reviewers that will just They look down on including like book references or other references. And that means so much information is being excluded. And for example, one of the books was The Attention Merchants, was written by a historian who looked at the history of advertising and the impact of attention in that. And so many of his sources were historical sources. And a lot of them, the only available sources were newspaper clippings from the past. And in a couple of cases, I traced the newspaper clippings to the original sources. And they were mostly accurate. There was a little bit of distortion, but this is where I came to asking, what is the best source for this person? And then I also found that popular writers should either stay away from writing about neuroscience, or if they're going to, they need to do a much better job. This is where I would agree. And I can imagine anyone who is doing studies in cognitive science or neuroscience, and then they would see how people represented the field or their work overall, and it just was not well done by any means. In fact, a few of the authors, not just Holloway and Rady, but they, even Watson, instead of citing the vast number of studies in neuroscience, which, the one book, the neuropsychology of attention, that had something like, I'm forgetting right now, but like 17,000 references. It was, or 100 references. It was a crazy amount. So you can imagine how much there would be to cite. And instead, Gay Watson just interviewed a neuroscientist and just asked him his opinions. And then, let's see, I think that would be it. So I'm just going to move here and say not time for Q&A, and thank you for your attention.